The cemetery was silent except for the wind whispering through tall grass. Chayton knelt beside the fresh grave, his weathered hands trembling as he placed sage on the dark soil. The baby in his arms, his daughter Ayanna, whimpered weakly, her tiny chest rising and falling in desperate breaths. 6 months. That's how long she had fought to stay alive. 6 months since her mother, Winona, had died bringing her into this world, bleeding out beneath a crimson sunset. Now, as Chayton looked at his daughter's pale face, he saw death creeping closer. "She won't last another day without milk," the tribal medicine woman had told him that morning. "The goat's milk isn't enough. She needs a woman's milk, or—" The elder hadn't finished. She didn't need to. Chayton rose slowly. At 30, he felt ancient. Years of war, of watching his people driven from their lands, of losing everyone he loved. It had carved deep lines into his face. But none of that mattered now. Only Ayanna mattered. He walked to his paint mare, securing the baby against his chest with soft deerskin. Ayanna barely stirred, her breathing almost imperceptible. "We're going to find help, little bird," he whispered in Lakota, using Winona's pet name for their daughter. "Even if it means going to the white settlements?" The thought made his jaw clench. Chayton had sworn never to enter a white town again, not after what happened to his brother Tokala. Found beaten and shot in a ditch near Deadwood, dismissed as an unfortunate misunderstanding. But desperation had a way of breaking the strongest oaths. He remembered the map from the trading post. Sage Valley, a small settlement, a day's ride southeast. Smaller towns sometimes meant less trigger-happy citizens when they saw an Indian approaching. The sun climbed higher as he rode east, pushing the mare harder than usual. Every mile brought them closer to salvation or death. He wasn't sure which frightened him more. He'd survived cavalry charges and bear attacks, but begging white strangers for his daughter's life made his hands shake. By late afternoon, Ayanna had stopped crying altogether. She lay against his chest like a fragile bird, her skin cool despite the warm sun. Chayton pressed his ear to her tiny chest. Her heartbeat was barely detectable. "Hold on, little bird," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "Just a little longer." Sage Valley's buildings appeared as the sun began its descent. Chayton studied the settlement from a low rise. Maybe 50 buildings, 200 souls. 200 white souls who would see threat before father. He checked his weapons, making them visible but non-threatening. He needed these people to understand he came seeking help, not conflict. The baby stirred weakly, and Chayton felt desperate hope surge through him. Still alive. Still time. As he rode down the main street, people reacted predictably, stopping, staring, progressing from surprise to suspicion to fear. A woman pulled her child away. Men emerged from the saloon, hands near their guns. Chayton ignored them all, scanning for what he needed most, a house where he might find a nursing mother. Then he saw her. The woman was hanging laundry behind a modest white house, auburn hair catching the afternoon light. Even from distance, he could see she was young, perhaps 25, and the careful way she moved suggested what he desperately hoped. This woman had recently given birth. As he dismounted and walked toward her yard, clutching his dying daughter, Chayton felt his entire world balanced on this single moment. Everything, Ayanna's life, his shattered heart, any possible future, would be decided by how this stranger reacted when she turned and saw a Lakota warrior holding a baby slipping away with each breath. The woman heard his footsteps and began to turn, her hands shading her eyes against the setting sun. Mary Catherine Whitmore looked up from the clothesline, her green eyes widening as she saw the tall Lakota warrior standing at her garden's edge. His weathered face was marked by grief and desperation, but it wasn't his imposing presence that made her breath catch. It was the tiny bundle he clutched against his chest. A baby, so small and still she feared it might already be too late. "Please," the man said, his English accented but clear. "My daughter, she is dying." Mary Catherine's hand instinctively moved to her chest, where beneath her simple blue dress, milk still came despite having no child to feed. 3 months ago, she had buried her newborn son, William, taken by fever at 2 weeks old. The grief had nearly destroyed her, leaving her hollow in this empty house. But now, looking at this desperate father, Something stirred in her heart that had been silent for months. "Let me see her," she said softly, setting down the wet sheet. Chayton stepped forward cautiously, his dark eyes searching her face for deception or threat. Desperation had driven him past caution, but he had learned not to trust easily, especially white settlers who had reasons to hate his people. He carefully unwrapped the deerskin bundle, revealing a tiny girl with dusky skin and delicate features. The baby's lips were pale, her breathing barely visible. "Oh, sweet Lord," Mary Catherine whispered, maternal instincts overriding every other consideration. "She's burning with fever. How long has she been like this?" "2 days without eating," Chayton replied, his voice rough with exhaustion. "Her mother died in childbirth. The tribal women tried goat's milk, but—" He shook his head helplessly. Mary Catherine had seen enough sickly babies to know this child was on death's doorstep. But she had also seen miracles when the right care was given at the right moment. "Come inside," she said without hesitation. "Quickly." Chayton followed her into the modest frame house, his keen eyes taking in every detail. Room layouts, windows, doors, potential escape routes if this became a trap. But the woman seemed genuinely concerned about his daughter, not about inviting a Lakota warrior into her home. The interior was simple but clean, with hand-sewn curtains and a stone fireplace. Mary Catherine gestured toward a rocking chair near the hearth. "Sit there," she instructed, moving toward a wooden chest. "I need to examine her properly." Chayton settled into the chair, feeling strange in this white woman's parlor. Everything spoke of a genteel life he'd never known. Delicate china, leather-bound books, a piano that looked recently played. Mary Catherine returned with clean cloths and a small bottle. "This is laudanum. Just a tiny bit to ease her pain while I—" She paused, studying his face. "You understand what she needs, don't you?" Chayton nodded grimly. "You would nurse her, feed her with your own milk." "Yes." Mary Catherine's cheeks colored slightly, but her voice remained steady. "It's the only thing that might save her. But if anyone in town sees what's happening, it could mean trouble for both of us. They don't take kindly to Indians here." "I know the risks," Chayton replied, "but she is all I have left. If you can save her—" His voice broke slightly. "I will give you anything I have." Mary Catherine shook her head. "I don't want payment. I lost my own baby 3 months ago. If I can save yours—" She swallowed hard, then straightened with new resolve. "Give her to me." Chayton hesitated for just a moment. Everything in his warrior's training screamed against trusting this stranger, this woman whose people had spent decades trying to destroy his. But his daughter's breathing had grown even more labored, and he could feel death hovering like a vulture. He placed Ayanna into Mary Catherine's arms. The moment the baby settled against her chest, Mary Catherine felt something shift inside. A maternal instinct she'd thought had died with William came roaring back to life. Holding this tiny Lakota girl felt like coming home to a part of herself she'd lost. "What's her name?" she asked softly, beginning to unbutton her dress. "Ayanna," Chayton replied. "It means eternal blossom in my language." "That's beautiful," Mary Catherine said, settling into another chair and positioning the baby carefully. The moment Ayanna's lips found what they desperately needed, the change was almost miraculous. The tiny girl latched on with surprising strength, her weak cries fading into contented whimpers. Color began returning to her pale cheeks. For the first time in days, Chayton allowed himself to hope. "She's strong," Mary Catherine murmured, stroking the baby's downy black hair. "Stronger than she looks." They sat in comfortable silence, watching Ayanna feed with growing enthusiasm. Late afternoon sun slanted through the windows, casting golden light across the scene. A Lakota warrior, a white widow, and a baby who belonged to both worlds and neither. Finally, Mary Catherine looked up. "You can't stay in town openly, but there's a line shack about a mile north. Belongs to the Hendersons, but they never use it. You could camp there, come back when she needs feeding." Chayton nodded slowly. "You would do this? Even knowing the danger?" Mary Catherine smiled, the first genuine smile across her lips in months. "I've been dead inside since William died. Taking care of Ayanna makes me feel alive again." As if in response to her words, a harsh voice called from the front yard. "Mary Catherine, you in there?" Both adults froze. Mary Catherine quickly covered herself in the baby while Chayton's hand moved to his knife. "That's Sheriff Coleman," she whispered. "He must have seen your horse." Before Chayton could move, heavy footsteps crossed the porch, and the door burst open without a knock. Sheriff Coleman stood in the doorway, a heavy-set man with graying hair and cold blue eyes that immediately locked onto Chayton. His hand rested on his holstered Colt, his expression leaving no doubt about his intentions. "Well, well," he drawled. "Looks like we've got ourselves an uninvited visitor." The baby sensed the tension and began to cry. Weak, pitiful sounds that tore at both Chayton's and Mary Catherine's hearts. But Coleman showed no sympathy. "Mary Catherine, step away from that savage," he ordered. "No telling what diseases he might be carrying." "He's not a savage," Mary Catherine replied firmly, clutching Ayanna protectively. "He's a father whose baby is sick, and I'm helping him." Coleman's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Helping him? Woman, have you lost your mind? This is exactly the kind of foolishness that gets decent folks killed." Chayton rose slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening, despite every instinct screaming at him to reach for his weapons. He had to think of Ayanna now, not his own pride. "I mean no harm," he said quietly. "I came only seeking help for my daughter." "Your daughter?" Coleman laughed harshly. "That baby's probably stolen from some poor family you butchered." The accusation hit Chayton like a physical blow. His jaw clenched, and Mary Catherine saw his arms tense with barely controlled fury. "Sheriff Coleman," she said with authority, "that baby is clearly mixed blood. Look at her features. She's this man's daughter, not some kidnapped child." Coleman squinted at Ayanna, taking in her dusky skin and delicate bone structure. Even he could see the resemblance. "Mixed blood," he spat. "That's even worse." "This isn't over," Coleman said, backing toward the door after a tense standoff. "Mark my words, Mary Catherine. You're making a mistake that's going to get you killed." He stalked out, boot heels echoing angrily across the porch. Chayton slowly lowered his hand from his knife. "He will be back, with more men." Mary Catherine nodded, her face pale but determined. "Probably, but not tonight." She looked down at Ayanna, who had dozed off in her arms. "We need to get you both somewhere safe," she continued, "and figure out how to keep feeding her without the whole town finding out." As the sun set over Sage Valley, two people from different worlds found themselves bound together by the tiny life sleeping peacefully between them. Outside, gathering voices suggested Coleman was already making good on his threat. But inside Mary Catherine's parlor, for this one perfect moment, love had triumphed over hate, and a dying baby had found exactly what she needed to survive. The first pale light of dawn crept through Mary Catherine's bedroom window as she woke to the soft sounds of baby Ayanna stirring in the makeshift cradle beside her bed. She had fashioned it from a wooden crate lined with her softest quilts, the same ones she had prepared for little William before fever took him away. For a moment, in that drowsy space between sleep and waking, Mary Catherine forgot about everything that had happened the day before. Then Ayanna made a small, hungry sound, and reality came flooding back. The desperate Lakota warrior, the sheriff's threats, and the impossible situation she had willingly walked into. She sat up carefully, her body still tender from months of unused milk finally serving its purpose. Through the night she had fed Ayanna 3 times, watching in amazement as the baby grew stronger with each feeding. The deathly pallor was gone from the child's skin, replaced by a healthy glow that spoke of life returning to her tiny body. "Good morning, little one," Mary Catherine whispered, lifting Ayanna from the crate. The baby's dark eyes, so much like her father's, focused on Mary Catherine's face with an alertness that hadn't been there yesterday. As she settled into the rocking chair by the window to nurse, Mary Catherine found herself thinking about Chayton. True to his word, he had disappeared into the night after Sheriff Coleman left, but not before they had arranged a system. He would return each morning and evening, using the back garden gate to avoid the main street. Between feedings, he would stay at the abandoned Henderson line shack, keeping watch for any signs of trouble. The arrangement was dangerous for both of them, but looking down at Ayanna's content face as she nursed, Mary Catherine knew she had made the right choice. This baby had brought something back to life in her that she thought was gone forever. The fierce, protective love of a mother. A soft knock at the back door interrupted her thoughts. Mary Catherine quickly covered herself and moved to peek through the kitchen curtains. Chayton stood in her garden, holding his hat in his hands, his long hair loose around his shoulders in the morning light. She opened the door quietly, mindful of her neighbors who might be stirring. "How is she?" he asked immediately, his eyes searching her face for any sign of bad news. "See for yourself," Mary Catherine said, stepping aside to let him enter. The transformation in Chayton's expression when he saw his daughter was remarkable. The hard lines of worry that had aged his face beyond his 30 years softened, and something that might have been hope flickered in his dark eyes. "She looks," he began, then stopped, as if afraid to voice what he was thinking. "She looks healthy," Mary Catherine finished for him. "The fever broke around midnight, and she's been eating well ever since." Chayton reached out tentatively, his weathered finger gently stroking Ayana's cheek. The baby turned toward the touch, her tiny hand grasping his finger with surprising strength. "Ayana," he murmured in Lakota, his voice thick with emotion. "My little bird lives." Mary Catherine found herself blinking back tears at the tenderness in his voice. She had heard the stories, terrible tales of savage Indians who showed no mercy, no emotion beyond rage and bloodlust. But the man before her was simply a father, overwhelmed with gratitude that his child was alive. "There's something I need to tell you," she said quietly, "about why I'm doing this." Chayton looked up, wariness creeping back into his expression. Mary Catherine took a breath, then began to speak in a voice barely above a whisper. "My husband David died 2 years ago. Consumption took him slowly, and I watched him waste away for months. When he was gone, I thought I could handle the loneliness. I had always been strong, independent, but then I found out I was carrying his child." She paused, her arms tightening slightly around Ayana. "I was so happy. It felt like David had left me a piece of himself, something to fill the emptiness. I spent months preparing, making tiny clothes, setting up a nursery, and when William was born," her voice broke slightly, "he was perfect. 10 fingers, 10 toes, the most beautiful baby I had ever seen." Chayton remained silent, but his expression had gentled, recognizing the pain of a parent's loss. "He lived for exactly 14 days, Mary Catherine continued, "just long enough for me to fall completely in love with him. Then the fever came, and there was nothing I could do. I held him as he died, and I wanted to die too. For 3 months, I have been walking through life like a ghost, going through the motions but feeling nothing." She looked down at Ayana, who had fallen asleep in her arms. "But yesterday, when you put your daughter in my arms, something woke up inside me. For the first time since William died, I felt alive. I felt needed, important. Like maybe there was a reason I survived when they didn't." Chayton was quiet for a long moment, studying this remarkable woman who had risked everything for his child. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "My wife, Winona, she would have done the same thing," he said. "She always said that mothers understand each other, no matter what color their skin. She would have liked you." Mary Catherine felt warmth spread through her chest at the words. "Tell me about her." A soft smile crossed Chayton's face. "She was the daughter of our medicine woman, very strong, very stubborn. When the soldiers came to move our people to the reservation, she refused to go. She said this land was in her blood, and she would rather die than leave it." "Is that why you're not on the reservation?" Chayton nodded grimly. "There are perhaps 20 of us left, hiding in the sacred places the soldiers haven't found yet. We move constantly, never staying in one place long enough to be tracked. It is no life for a baby, but," he shrugged, "it was the only life we had to offer her. And now I don't know. Ayana needs stability, regular feedings, safety, things I cannot give her while living as a fugitive. But I cannot give her up either. She is all that remains of Winona, of our people's future." Mary Catherine rocked gently, thinking. An idea was forming in her mind. Dangerous, probably impossible, but what if she didn't have to choose? She said finally. Chayton frowned. "What do you mean? What if there was a way for her to have both, your heritage and culture, but also safety and stability?" "I don't understand." Mary Catherine took a deep breath. What if, what if I kept her here during the day, as her wet nurse, her caregiver, and you visited regularly, taught her your language, your traditions? She would grow up knowing both worlds. Chayton stared at her. You would do that? Raise a half-Indian child in a white town? I would raise her as my own, Mary Catherine said firmly. Let people think what they want. I'm a widow. I can claim I adopted her from missionaries or something. Most people won't ask too many questions if I don't volunteer information. And the sheriff? He knows the truth. Mary Catherine's jaw set with determination. Sheriff Coleman is a bully, but he's also a coward. If I stand my ground and don't give him legal cause to interfere, he'll eventually back down, especially if Ayanna is healthy and clearly being well cared for. Chayton was quiet for a long time, clearly wrestling with the decision. Finally, he looked up at Mary Catherine. You would be willing to face the town's disapproval? The whispers, the accusations? I've been facing whispers my whole life, Mary Catherine replied. First for marrying too young, then for being childless too long, then for being widowed too early. Let them whisper about this too. I've learned that people will always find something to criticize, so you might as well give them something worthwhile. A knock at the front door made them both freeze. Mary Catherine quickly handed Ayanna to Chayton and moved to peer through the parlor curtains. It's Mrs. Henderson, she whispered. My neighbor. She probably saw the smoke from my chimney and came to check on me. Quick, the back room. Chayton disappeared with Ayanna just as the knock came again, more insistent this time. Mary Catherine? Are you all right, dear? I saw your lamp burning all night. Mary Catherine smoothed her hair and opened the door, forcing a smile. Good morning, Eleanor. I'm fine. Just couldn't sleep. Eleanor Henderson was a thin, sharp-featured woman in her 50s who made it her business to know everyone else's business. Her pale eyes darted past Mary Catherine, trying to see into the house. I thought I heard voices, she said suspiciously. And there was talk in town yesterday about unsavory visitors. Just me talking to myself, I'm afraid, Mary Catherine replied smoothly. You know how it is when you live alone. Sometimes you need to hear a voice, even if it's your own. Eleanor didn't look convinced, but before she could press further, the sound of baby's cry came from the back room. Both women froze. What was that? Eleanor demanded. Mary Catherine's mind raced. That was my cat. Got his tail caught in something, I think. Excuse me. She started to close the door, but Eleanor pushed past her into the house. That didn't sound like any cat I've ever heard, she said, her eyes scanning the parlor suspiciously. The cry came again, louder this time, and unmistakably human. Eleanor's eyes widened. Mary Catherine Whitmore, is there a baby in this house? There was no point in lying now. Mary Catherine straightened her shoulders and looked her neighbor in the eye. Yes, she said simply, there is. Eleanor's face went through a series of expressions, surprise, confusion, then dawning suspicion. Whose baby is it? She demanded. And don't try to tell me it's yours. The whole town knows you buried your child 3 months ago. Mary Catherine felt trapped, her careful plans crumbling around her. But then she heard Chayton's voice from the back room, singing softly in Lakota, a lullaby that seemed to calm Ayanna immediately. The sound made her decision for her. The baby belongs to someone who needed help, she said firmly, and that's all you need to know. Eleanor's face hardened. I see. Well, we'll just see what Sheriff Coleman has to say about this. She turned and marched out, leaving Mary Catherine standing in her doorway with her heart pounding and her future hanging in the balance. Chayton emerged from the back room, Ayanna quiet in his arms. She will bring trouble, he said grimly. Mary Catherine nodded, but her resolve hadn't wavered. Then we'll face it together. Ayanna needs us both, and I won't abandon her now. As Eleanor Henderson's footsteps faded down the street, heading directly toward the sheriff's office, Mary Catherine and Chayton looked at each other across the small parlor. The battle for Ayanna's future was about to begin in earnest, but they were no longer fighting it alone. 2 weeks had passed since Eleanor Henderson's discovery, and somehow the world hadn't ended. Mary Catherine had expected Sheriff Coleman to return with a posse, demanding answers and threatening arrests. Instead, an uneasy quiet had settled over Sage Valley, like the stillness before a thunderstorm that everyone knew was coming, but no one could predict when it would strike. During those precious 14 days, a routine had developed between Mary Catherine and Chayton that felt almost natural. He would arrive each morning just after sunrise, slipping through her back garden like a shadow, carrying gifts from the wilderness, wild berries, medicinal herbs, sometimes a rabbit or fish he had caught. She would have coffee ready and Ayana fed and content, eager to share the small milestones that marked the baby's growing strength. This morning was no different. Mary Catherine heard the familiar soft knock and opened her kitchen door to find Chayton standing with a handful of early wildflowers, purple prairie asters that grew in the meadows beyond town. "For your table," he said simply, though the gesture felt more significant than his quiet words suggested. "They're beautiful," Mary Catherine replied, accepting the flowers and breathing in their sweet fragrance. "Ayana was asking for you earlier. Well, as much as a 7-month-old can ask for anything." Chayton's weathered face softened with something that might have been a smile. Over the past 2 weeks, Mary Catherine had noticed these small changes in him, moments where the hard mask of the warrior slipped away, revealing the gentle father underneath. She led him into the parlor where Ayana lay on a quilt spread on the floor, reaching for a wooden rattle Mary Catherine had found in her trunk of baby things. The moment she saw her father, the baby made excited sounds and kicked her chubby legs. "She's getting stronger," Chayton observed, settling cross-legged on the floor beside his daughter. Without hesitation, he began speaking to her in Lakota, his voice taking on the musical cadences of his native tongue. Mary Catherine had been listening to these one-sided conversations for days, and while she didn't understand the words, she was beginning to recognize the rhythm and flow of the language. Sometimes she caught Chayton watching her with an unreadable expression, as if he were trying to decide something important. This morning he seemed to reach some internal conclusion. "Would you like to learn?" he asked suddenly. "Learn what?" "Lakota, so you can speak to Ayana in both languages." Mary Catherine felt something flutter in her chest, a mixture of surprise and warmth. "You would teach me?" "She is growing up in your world," Chayton said, lifting Ayana and holding her against his shoulder. "But she should know where she comes from. If you could speak to her of her mother's people, tell her stories in the language of her blood." "I would like that very much," Mary Catherine said softly. They spent the next hour with Chayton teaching her simple words: Ina for mother, Eight for father, Wisinkala for baby girl. Mary Catherine's tongue stumbled over the unfamiliar sounds, making Chayton's lips quirk with suppressed amusement at her attempts. "You sound like a white woman trying to speak Lakota," he said, which earned him a playful swat on the arm from Mary Catherine. "Well, I am a white woman trying to speak Lakota," she retorted, then caught herself. The casual familiarity of the gesture, touching him, teasing him, felt simultaneously natural and completely inappropriate. But Chayton didn't seem offended. If anything, his expression had grown thoughtful, studying her face with an intensity that made her cheeks warm. "What is it?" she asked. "You are not what I expected," he said finally. "What did you expect?" "Fear, hatred, the things I have always seen in white eyes when they look at me." He paused. "But you look at me like I am simply a man." Mary Catherine felt her heart skip a beat. "Isn't that what you are?" Before Chayton could answer, a commotion from the street outside interrupted them. Voices were raised in argument, and through the window, Mary Catherine could see a crowd gathering near the general store. "What's happening?" she wondered aloud, moving to peer through the lace curtains. Chayton was instantly alert, his body tensing with the instinctive readiness of a warrior sensing danger. "Are they coming here?" "I don't think so. It looks like—" Mary Catherine squinted, trying to make out what was happening in the crowd. "Oh no, that's Dr. Morrison in the middle of it all, and he looks angry." Dr. Samuel Morrison was Sage Valley's only physician, an elderly man with white whiskers and kind eyes who had delivered half the babies in town, including Mary Catherine's poor William. If he was involved in some kind of public argument, it meant trouble. "I should go see what's wrong," Mary Catherine said, reaching for her shawl. "Doctor, Morrison has been good to me since David died. If someone's giving him trouble—" "No." Chayton's voice was sharp with authority. "It's too dangerous." What if this is about us? Mary Catherine paused, considering. Then I need to know. If the whole town is talking about Ayana, I can't just hide in here and pretend it's not happening. She could see the conflict in Chayton's face, the desire to protect her warring with the knowledge that she was right. Finally, he nodded grimly. Then we go together. Chayton, you can't. If people see you, they will see a father protecting his child and the woman who saved her, he said firmly. I will not hide while you face danger alone. Mary Catherine felt something warm and unfamiliar unfold in her chest at his words. When was the last time someone had wanted to protect her? When had anyone ever considered her worth defending? They wrapped Ayana in a soft blanket and made their way toward the disturbance, Chayton keeping to the shadows between buildings, while Mary Catherine approached the crowd directly. As they drew closer, she could hear Dr. Morrison's voice raised in indignation. Absolutely ridiculous. I've been practicing medicine in this territory for 30 years, and I won't stand by and listen to such ignorant nonsense. Now see here, Doc, came Sheriff Coleman's voice, edged with irritation. Nobody's questioning your abilities. We're just saying that certain associations might not be appropriate for a man in your position. What associations? Dr. Morrison demanded. Treating sick people regardless of their race? Following my oath to do no harm? If that's inappropriate, then this town has lost its moral compass. Mary Catherine felt her blood run cold. They were talking about Chayton and Ayana. They had to be. She pushed through the edge of the crowd, catching sight of Dr. Morrison's flushed face and wild white hair. Around him stood most of the town's prominent citizens, including Eleanor Henderson, whose sharp features were arranged in an expression of righteous satisfaction. Dr. Morrison, Mary Catherine called out, her voice carrying clearly across the square. Is everything all right? The crowd turned toward her, and she felt the weight of dozens of stares, some curious, some hostile, most simply uncomfortable. Eleanor Henderson's eyes narrowed with malicious triumph. Mary Catherine, Dr. Morrison said, relief evident in his voice. Perfect timing. Perhaps you can help these good people understand the difference between Christian charity and whatever twisted prejudice they're trying to dress up as moral concern. Sheriff Coleman stepped forward, his hand resting on his gun belt in a gesture that was meant to intimidate. Mrs. Whitmore, I think it's time we had an honest conversation about your house guests. Mary Catherine lifted her chin, drawing on every ounce of dignity her late husband had taught her. I'm not sure what you mean, Sheriff. Don't play games with me, Coleman snarled. Half the town has seen smoke from your chimney at all hours, heard crying at night. Eleanor here says she saw evidence of an Indian in your house. Now Dr. Morrison comes to me, asking about infant care supplies and wet nursing, claiming it's for a patient, but refusing to say who. Dr. Morrison's cheeks reddened. Patient confidentiality is a sacred trust, Sheriff. I won't betray it to satisfy gossip and prejudice. Even when that patient might be a savage's bastard? Eleanor Henderson interjected, her voice sharp with venom. The crowd murmured at her crude language, but Mary Catherine noticed that no one contradicted her. Especially then, Dr. Morrison replied firmly. A baby is a baby, Mrs. Henderson. They don't choose their parents any more than you chose yours, though in some cases that might be considered a mercy. Eleanor gasped in outrage, but before she could respond, a new voice cut through the tension. Perhaps, said Chayton, stepping out from the shadows with Ayana in his arms, it would be better to speak directly to the father. The crowd's reaction was immediate and electric. Women gasped and stepped back. Men reached for weapons that weren't there, and Sheriff Coleman's hand closed around his gun butt. But Dr. Morrison stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the baby in Chayton's arms. May I? He asked gently, holding out his hands. Chayton hesitated for a moment, then placed Ayana in the doctor's arms. The old physician examined her with practiced hands, checking her breathing, her color, her reflexes. Remarkable, he murmured. 2 weeks ago, this child was dying. Now look at her, healthy, alert, thriving. Whoever has been caring for her has done extraordinary work. That would be Mary Catherine, Chayton said quietly. Dr. Morrison looked up at Mary Catherine with something like wonder in his eyes. You saved her life. We saved her life, Mary Catherine corrected, stepping closer to Chayton's side. Together. The crowd buzzed with shocked whispers, but Mary Catherine kept her eyes fixed on Dr. Morrison's face. His opinion carried more weight in this town than anyone else's, if he sided with them. Sheriff Coleman, Dr. Morrison said finally, his voice carrying the authority of his years and position. I see a healthy baby and two people who have shown extraordinary courage and compassion. If you see something criminal in that, then the problem lies with your vision, not their actions. Coleman's face darkened with rage. Doc, you're making a mistake. These people are under my medical protection, Dr. Morrison interrupted smoothly. The baby was my patient, and anyone who interferes with her care will answer to the Territorial Medical Board. I believe they take a dim view of local officials who obstruct medical treatment. It was a masterful stroke. Coleman might be willing to bully a widow and threaten an Indian, but he wouldn't risk his position by defying territorial authority. The sheriff's hand fell away from his gun, but his eyes promised that this wasn't over. Fine, he growled, but don't come crying to me when this all goes bad. Blood will tell, and savage blood tells loudest of all. As the crowd began to disperse, muttering among themselves, Mary Catherine felt Chayton's hand brush against hers. Just for a moment, just enough to steady her shaking fingers. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you, he replied. Dr. Morrison approached them, still holding Ayanna, who was gazing up at him with curious dark eyes. I believe, he said with a slight smile, that we need to have a longer conversation about this young lady's care. Perhaps over dinner? I find medical consultations go much better with good food and better company. Mary Catherine felt tears prick her eyes. She hadn't realized how desperately she needed an ally until she had one. We would be honored, she said. As they walked back toward her house, Chayton fell into step beside her, and for the first time since this all began, Mary Catherine allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, they could make this work. Behind them, the whispers continued, but ahead lay the promise of friendship, understanding, and perhaps something even more precious, the possibility that love really could conquer hate. The fragile peace that had settled over Sage Valley after Dr. Morrison's public defense lasted exactly 6 days. Mary Catherine should have known it was too good to be true. In a town where gossip traveled faster than wildfire, secrets had a way of growing larger and more dangerous with each telling. It began with Mrs. Patterson, the banker's wife, claiming she'd seen unseemly shadows moving around Mary Catherine's house after dark. Then old Jim Fletcher insisted he'd heard heathen chanting coming from her garden one evening when he'd walked by on his way to the saloon. By the third day, Eleanor Henderson was spreading tales of unnatural rituals and corrupted Christian souls. Mary Catherine tried to ignore the whispers, the way conversations stopped when she entered the general store, the children who were suddenly called inside when she walked past their yards. She focused on what mattered, Ayanna's growing strength, Chayton's gentle presence, and the unlikely friendship developing with Dr. Morrison, who had taken to joining them for dinner twice a week. But ignoring a problem didn't make it disappear, and on this particular Tuesday morning, the problem arrived at her front door in the form of 5 angry men, led by Harold Maddox, the town banker and unofficial leader of Sage Valley's more respectable citizens. Mary Catherine was feeding Ayanna in the kitchen when the heavy pounding began. Through the window, she could see Chayton chopping wood in the back garden, a domestic scene that had become precious to her over the past 3 weeks. They had fallen into an easy rhythm, sharing the work of caring for Ayanna, teaching each other their respective languages and customs, creating something that felt dangerously close to family. The pounding came again, more insistent this time. Mary Catherine Whitmore! Harold Maddox's voice boomed through the door. We know you're in there. Open up. We need to talk. Mary Catherine quickly covered herself and called softly toward the garden. Chayton, trouble. He appeared instantly, as if he'd been expecting this moment. Without a word, he took Ayanna and melted into the back room while Mary Catherine composed herself and opened the front door. Harold Maddox stood on her porch flanked by 4 other men she recognized. Tom Bradley from the hardware store, Samuel Curtis, who ran the telegraph office, Jake Morrison, no relation to Dr. Morrison despite the name, and Sheriff Coleman, who wore an expression of grim satisfaction. Gentlemen, Mary Catherine said coolly, what can I do for you? You can start by telling the truth, Maddox replied, his round face flushed with righteous anger. About what's really going on in this house. I'm not sure what you mean. Don't play innocent with us, Mary Catherine, Tom Bradley interjected. The whole town's talking. That Indian's been living here, hasn't he? Sleeping under your roof, eating at your table? Corrupting a good Christian woman, Samuel Curtis added with obvious disgust. Mary Catherine felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she kept her voice steady. Mr. Chayton visits to see his daughter. Nothing more. Any other interpretation is the product of small minds and smaller hearts. His daughter? Jake Morrison spat. That half-breed bastard isn't anybody's daughter worth claiming. The words hit Mary Catherine like a slap. That baby is an innocent child who nearly died before I helped save her life. If you can't see the difference between an infant in need and whatever twisted fantasies your prejudice has created, then I pity you. Sheriff Coleman stepped forward, his hand resting on his gun belt. Mrs. Whitmore, we're here on official business. There have been complaints, serious complaints, about inappropriate behavior, harboring fugitives, and... He paused dramatically, clearly savoring the moment. Adultery. The word hung in the air like a curse. Mary Catherine felt the world tilt slightly around her. Adultery? She repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Living in sin with a savage, Harold Maddox confirmed. Sharing your bed with a murderous heathen. It's an abomination before God and man. That's a lie, Mary Catherine said, finding her voice again. Nothing improper has happened in this house. I am caring for a sick baby, nothing more. Then you won't mind if we search the premises, Coleman said, pushing past her into the house, just to make sure your story holds up. The other men followed, spreading through her small home like a disease. Mary Catherine's heart pounded as she thought of Chayton and Ayanna hidden in the back room. If they found them. Now see here, came a familiar voice from the garden gate. Dr. Morrison hurried up the path, his black medical bag in hand and his white hair disheveled. What's the meaning of this intrusion? Official business, Doc, Coleman called from inside the house. Nothing that concerns you. Everything concerning the health and welfare of my patients concerns me, Dr. Morrison replied sharply, stepping onto the porch. Mary Catherine, are you all right? Before she could answer, a crash came from inside the house, followed by Tom Bradley's triumphant voice. Found something. Sheriff, you need to see this. Mary Catherine's blood turned to ice. They had discovered the makeshift cradle in her bedroom, the one she'd made for Ayanna. Bradley emerged from the house holding the wooden crate lined with soft quilts, his face twisted with disgust. Baby bed, he announced, hidden in her bedroom, plain as day. So? Dr. Morrison demanded. Mrs. Whitmore lost her own child recently. Perhaps she kept the cradle for sentimental reasons. Still warm, Bradley replied with a leer. And these quilts smell like, well, like something other than white folks. Harold Maddox's face darkened. Mary Catherine, I'm going to ask you one more time, and I want the truth. Is there an Indian baby in this house? Mary Catherine looked around at the circle of hostile faces, then at Dr. Morrison's kind but worried expression. She thought of Ayanna, probably terrified by the loud voices and crashing sounds. She thought of Chayton, undoubtedly preparing for the fight of his life to protect his daughter, and she made her choice. Yes, she said clearly, there is. The reaction was immediate and explosive. The men began shouting over each other, their voices rising in a cacophony of outrage and condemnation. Knew it! Disgusting! Unnatural! Sinful! Sheriff Coleman raised his hand for silence. Where is it? She, Mary Catherine corrected firmly. Her name is Ayanna, and she's in the back room with her father. Bring them out, Coleman ordered. Now. Mary Catherine walked slowly to the back room, her mind racing. When she opened the door, she found Chayton standing with Ayanna in his arms, his face set in grim lines. He had heard everything. They want to see you, she said softly. I know. His dark eyes met hers. Whatever happens, remember that you saved her. You gave her life when no one else would. Nothing's going to happen, Mary Catherine said with more confidence than she felt. Dr. Morrison is here, and he is one man against many, Chayton interrupted. I have lived among white men long enough to know how this ends. He stepped past her into the main room, carrying Ayanna with the dignity of a king presenting his heir. The baby, perhaps sensing the tension, had gone very quiet, her dark eyes wide as she looked around at all the strange faces. The sight of her seemed to inflame the men's anger even further. "Look at it," Tom Bradley snarled. "Half-savage mongrel, probably grow up to scalp decent folks in their beds." "She's 7 months old," Mary Catherine snapped. "The only thing she's likely to scalp is her own hair when she starts teething." "Don't matter how young it is," Jake Morrison added. "Bad blood will tell. Should put it out of its misery now. Save everyone trouble later." Dr. Morrison stepped forward, his face pale with shock. "Mr. Morrison, no relation, thank God. Are you seriously suggesting we harm an infant?" "I'm suggesting we clean up this mess before it gets worse," Jake replied. "Starting with that thing, then moving on to the woman who's been harboring it." "That thing has a name," came a new voice from the doorway. Everyone turned to see Pastor Williams entering the house, his usually gentle face set in stern lines. Behind him came his wife, Martha, and to Mary Catherine's amazement, 3 other women from the church, Mrs. Kelly, Mrs. Thompson, and young Sarah Mitchell. "Pastor," Harold Maddox said, clearly surprised, "we didn't expect the church to involve itself in matters of Christian charity?" Pastor Williams interrupted. "Strange, since that's rather what we're supposed to be about." He walked directly to where Chayton stood with Ayanna, ignoring the men's hostile stares. "May I?" he asked gently, holding out his arms. Chayton hesitated, then carefully placed his daughter in the pastor's arms. Ayanna looked up at the white-haired man with curiosity rather than fear. "Beautiful child," Pastor Williams said softly. "What's her name?" "Ayanna," Chayton replied. "It means eternal blossom." "Fitting." The pastor looked around the room at the assembled men. "Gentlemen, I'm curious. Which of you has read the good book recently?" "What's that got to do with anything?" Tom Bradley demanded. "Well, there's this passage. Perhaps you've heard it. 'Suffer the little children to come unto me, and forbid them not.' Doesn't say anything about checking their bloodlines first." "Pastor," Sheriff Coleman said through gritted teeth, "that baby is the product of sin and degradation." "That baby," Pastor Williams interrupted, "is the product of love between a man and woman who were legally married according to the customs of his people. Her mother died giving her life, and her father has risked everything to save her. If you can find sin in that, Sheriff, then your understanding of morality is quite different from mine." Harold Maddox's face was turning purple. "Are you taking their side, Pastor? Against decent Christian folk?" "I'm taking the side of compassion over cruelty, love over hatred, and Christian charity over blind prejudice," Pastor Williams replied calmly. "If that makes me their ally, then so be it." Martha Williams stepped forward to stand beside her husband. "The women of this community have been talking, Mr. Maddox. We've watched Mary Catherine these past weeks, seen how she's thrown herself into caring for this child. We've seen the light come back into her eyes for the first time since she lost her own baby. If you think we're going to stand by and let you destroy that out of ignorance and spite, you're sadly mistaken." "Amen to that," said Mrs. Kelly firmly. "Hear, hear," added Mrs. Thompson. Sheriff Coleman looked around the room, clearly realizing that the simple intimidation he'd planned was turning into something much more complicated. "This is all very touching," he said sarcastically, "but the law is the law. That Indian is a fugitive from the reservation, and harboring him is a federal crime." "Actually," came another voice from the doorway, "that's not quite accurate." A stranger entered the house, a well-dressed man with a badge pinned to his vest and an air of quiet authority. "U.S. Marshal Davies," he introduced himself. "I've been investigating reports of illegal activity in this area." Sheriff Coleman straightened, clearly thinking reinforcement had arrived. "Marshal, perfect timing. We've got a situation here." "Yes, I can see that," Marshal Davies interrupted, his cool gaze taking in the hostile men, the supportive women, and the remarkable scene of a white pastor holding an Indian baby while the child's father stood proudly beside him. "Though it's not quite the situation I was expecting to find." He walked directly to Chayton. "You're Chayton Crowfeather?" "I am." "Brother to Takala Crowfeather?" Chayton's jaw tightened. Yes, Marshal Davies nodded grimly. Then you'll be interested to know that we've finally arrested the men who killed him. Turns out they've been robbing and murdering travelers for years, using hatred of Indians as cover for their crimes. Your brother wasn't their first victim, just their most convenient scapegoat. The room fell silent. Sheriff Coleman's face had gone pale. Furthermore, the marshal continued, the territorial government has been reviewing the cases of several small bands like yours who never formally surrendered or were assigned to reservations. It appears you and your people have been operating in a legal gray area. Not technically fugitives, but not formally recognized either. He pulled a document from his coat. This is an official territorial recognition of your band's right to remain on traditional lands, provided you register with local authorities and agree to certain accommodations. Chayton stared at the paper in disbelief. We can stay? You can stay. Your daughter can grow up in both worlds if you choose to let her. Marshal Davies looked around the room. Seems to me she's already got a pretty good start on that. What with a Lakota father and what would you call yourself, ma'am? Foster mother? Mary Catherine found her voice at last. I would call myself someone who loves her. Well then, Marshal Davies said with something that might have been a smile, I'd say this little girl is luckier than most. Harold Maddox sputtered with outrage. This is justice, Pastor William said firmly. This is what justice looks like when it's not blinded by hatred. As the hostile men filed out, grumbling and defeated, Mary Catherine felt Chayton's hand touch hers. Just briefly, just enough to share the moment of impossible victory. But she also noticed Sheriff Coleman's expression as he left, and the way several of the men whispered together in the yard. Their battle was won, but the war was far from over. The attack came 3 nights later, just as Mary Catherine had feared it would. She woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of breaking glass, her heart hammering against her ribs as she realized that the orange glow outside her bedroom window wasn't sunrise, it was fire. Chayton, she called, grabbing her robe and rushing to Ayana's cradle. The baby was awake, her dark eyes wide with fear at the unfamiliar sounds and acrid smoke beginning to seep through the walls. Chayton appeared instantly from the front room, where he'd been sleeping on the floor, fully dressed and alert. Over the past few days since Marshal Davies' visit, he had insisted on staying close to the house each night, claiming he needed to watch for trouble. Mary Catherine had protested that it wasn't proper, but secretly she'd been grateful for his presence. Now she knew why he'd been so insistent. The barn, he said grimly, peering through the smoke-hazed window. They set fire to your barn. Mary Catherine joined him at the window, clutching Ayana against her chest. In the flickering light of the flames, she could see dark figures moving around her property, at least 6 men with torches and what looked like rifles. Sheriff Coleman, she whispered. Probably, but not officially. Chayton's jaw was tight with controlled fury. This way they can claim it was just angry citizens taking matters into their own hands. A rock crashed through the kitchen window, followed immediately by a burning torch that landed on her wooden floor. The dry planks began to smolder instantly. We have to get out, Mary Catherine said. But even as the words left her mouth, she realized the hopelessness of their situation. The men outside would be watching every exit, waiting for them to emerge so they could finish what they'd started. Not yet, Chayton replied, already moving to stamp out the small fire before it could spread. They want us to panic, to run outside where they can claim we were threatening them. We wait. Another torch came through the front window, and this time Mary Catherine ran to smother it with one of her quilts, the fabric beginning to char in her hands. Chayton Crow Feather, came a voice from outside. Sheriff Coleman's voice, though he was trying to disguise it by shouting. Come out peacefully and no one gets hurt. What about Ayana and me? Mary Catherine called back. The woman can go free if she denounces her sinful ways and turns over the half-breed, came the reply. Otherwise, she burns with the rest of the corruption. Mary Catherine felt rage boil up inside her, hot and pure. My answer, she shouted, is that you can go straight to hell. A volley of gunshots answered her defiance, bullets splintering the wood around the windows. Mary Catherine threw herself to the floor, covering Ayana with her body, while Chayton grabbed his rifle from where he'd left it by the door. Stay down, he commanded, moving to a window where he could see the attackers. And stay away from the glass. More torches came through the broken windows, and despite their efforts to put them out, small fires were beginning to catch hold in several places. The smoke was getting thicker, making it hard to breathe and impossible to see clearly. Mary Catherine cradled Ayanna close, whispering soothing words while her mind raced. They couldn't stay here much longer. The house would become a death trap within minutes. But going outside meant facing at least 6 armed men who had already demonstrated their willingness to commit murder. Then she heard something that made her heart leap with desperate hope. The sound of hoofbeats approaching fast, and voices calling out in challenge to the attackers. "What's going on here?" came Dr. Morrison's voice, breathless from hard riding. "Official business, Doc," Sheriff Coleman replied, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "Nothing that concerns you." "A house burning with people inside it concerns me greatly," Dr. Morrison shot back, "especially when those people include my patients." "Step aside, old man," came another voice. Harold Maddox, Mary Catherine realized. "This is justice being served." "This is attempted murder," came a new voice, Pastor Williams, sounding more angry than Mary Catherine had ever heard him. "And I won't stand by and watch it happen." Through the smoke and broken windows, Mary Catherine could see that more people were arriving. Martha Williams on horseback, several other women from the church, and to her amazement, Marshal Davies himself. "Gentlemen," the marshal's voice cut through the night like a blade, "I suggest you drop your weapons and step away from that house. Now." "You don't have jurisdiction here, Davies," Coleman snarled. "This is local justice." "This is federal attempted murder of people under my protection," Davies interrupted. "And if that house burns with them inside it, I'll personally see that every man here hangs for it." Mary Catherine heard urgent whispers from the attackers, then the sound of some of them beginning to move away, but not all of them. Coleman and his core supporters were clearly prepared to see this through to the bitter end. "Last warning," Davies called out. "Surrender now or face the consequences." His answer came in the form of gunfire, not aimed at the house this time, but at the newcomers who had come to help. Mary Catherine heard Martha Williams cry out, and her blood ran cold. That was the moment Chayton made his decision. "Stay here," he told Mary Catherine, his voice deadly calm. "Keep Ayanna safe." Before she could protest, he was out the back door and moving through the smoke like a shadow. Mary Catherine pressed herself against the wall, clutching the baby and listening to the sounds of battle erupting outside. It was over quickly. Chayton had learned warfare from men who could move silently through enemy camps and strike without warning. Sheriff Coleman and his followers had learned their fighting in saloons and against unarmed victims. The outcome was never really in doubt. When the shooting stopped, Mary Catherine heard Marshal Davies calling her name. "Mary Catherine, are you hurt?" She emerged from the burning house on shaking legs, Ayanna still clutched against her chest. The scene in her yard was chaos. Several of the attackers lay groaning on the ground. Dr. Morrison was tending to what looked like a minor wound on Martha Williams's arm, and Sheriff Coleman knelt in the dirt with his hands behind his head, while Chayton held a knife to his throat. "Is everyone all right?" Mary Catherine asked, her voice hoarse from smoke. "We are now," Pastor Williams replied, his arm around his wife's shoulders. "Thanks to Mr. Crow Feather's intervention." Marshal Davies approached Coleman, his expression grim. "Sheriff, you are under arrest for attempted murder, arson, and conspiracy. You have the right to—" "You can't arrest me," Coleman sputtered. "I'm the law in this town." "You are the law," Davies corrected. "As of this moment, you're just another criminal." He looked around at the other attackers, most of whom were nursing wounds from their encounter with Chayton. "The rest of you are under federal arrest as well. Anyone who wants to cooperate with the investigation might find some leniency in their sentencing." Harold Maddox, clutching a bleeding shoulder, spoke up immediately. "This wasn't my idea. Coleman said it was legal, said we were just enforcing territorial law." "Shut up, Harold," Coleman snarled. But it was too late. The banker's words had opened the floodgates, and soon half the attackers were talking over each other, trying to shift blame and save their own skins. Mary Catherine looked around at her burned barn, her damaged house, and the men who had been willing to kill her, and an innocent baby out of nothing more than hatred and prejudice. Then she looked at the people who had risked their lives to save her: Dr. Morrison, Pastor Williams, Martha and the other church women, and Marshall Davies. But most of all, she looked at Chayton, who had just single-handedly defeated 6 armed men to protect her and Ayanna. "Thank you," she said simply, the words carrying the weight of everything she couldn't express. He nodded, his dark eyes holding hers for a moment that seemed to stretch forever. "We protect what we love," he said quietly. The words hung in the smoky air between them, loaded with meaning that made Mary Catherine's heart skip several beats. "Well," Dr. Morrison said with forced cheerfulness, clearly trying to break the tension, "I believe this calls for a celebration. Mary Catherine, would you and Mr. Crow Feather join me for breakfast? I think we all need something normal after this excitement." Mary Catherine looked down at Ayanna, who had slept through most of the violence and was now gazing up at her with trusting dark eyes. Then she looked at Chayton, this remarkable man who had come into her life as a desperate stranger and had somehow become— what had he become? Friend seemed too small a word. Protector was accurate but incomplete. The truth was both simpler and more complex than any label she could put on it. He had become the other half of her heart. "Yes," she said, her voice steady despite the emotions churning inside her. "I think we'd like that very much." As Marshall Davies led the arrested men away and the church women began helping clean up the damage, Mary Catherine stood in her yard holding the baby who had brought such chaos and joy into her life. Chayton stood beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body despite the cool morning air. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," he said, his voice soft but certain, "we build something new, something that belongs to both worlds and neither, something that's ours." Mary Catherine felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness, but from a happiness so pure and unexpected it took her breath away. "I'd like that," she whispered. "So would I," he replied. And as the sun rose over Sage Valley, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, 2 people from different worlds stood together with the child who had brought them home to each other, ready to face whatever came next as a family. The battle was over. Love had won. 3 months after the night that nearly destroyed everything, Mary Catherine stood in her rebuilt kitchen, flour dusting her apron as she prepared bread for the small celebration they had planned. Through the window, she could see Chayton teaching Ayanna, now a sturdy 10-month-old, how to clap her hands while speaking to her in Lakota. The baby's delighted giggles carried on the warm spring air, a sound that never failed to make Mary Catherine's heart swell with joy. The town had changed dramatically since Sheriff Coleman's arrest. Marshall Davies had appointed Pastor Williams as temporary sheriff, a decision that had met with surprising approval from most of the decent folks in Sage Valley. The banker Harold Maddox had been forced to sell his business to pay legal fees, and several of the other men involved in the attack had left town entirely rather than face the social consequences of their actions. More importantly, the people who remained had begun to see Chayton not as a threat, but as a man who had risked everything to protect an innocent woman and child. Dr. Morrison had officially hired him as a guide and translator for dealing with the other small bands of Lakota who were now coming forward to register with territorial authorities. The work gave him purpose and respect, 2 things he had never expected to find in a white settlement, but it was the smaller changes that meant the most to Mary Catherine. The way Mrs. Kelly from the church now stopped to admire Ayanna when they met in town. How young Sarah Mitchell had asked Chayton to teach her a few words in Lakota so she could greet Ayanna properly. The afternoon when Dr. Morrison had brought his grandson to play with Ayanna, treating her exactly like any other beloved child. "Almost ready?" Chayton asked, stepping into the kitchen with Ayanna balanced on his hip. The baby immediately reached for Mary Catherine, babbling happily in what sounded like a mixture of English and Lakota syllables. "Almost," Mary Catherine replied, taking Ayanna and settling her in the high chair Chayton had built with his own hands. "Are you nervous?" "Terrified," he admitted with a rueful smile. "I've faced cavalry charges that scared me less than this." Mary Catherine laughed, understanding his feelings perfectly. Today was the day they had been planning for weeks, the day Chayton had asked her to marry him, and she had said yes without hesitation. It would be a simple ceremony in Pastor Williams' church, with Dr. Morrison standing as witness and Martha Williams playing the piano. The proposal had come 2 weeks ago, on an evening when they were sitting on her front porch watching Ayana crawl around on a blanket. They had been talking about practical things, repairs to the barn, plans for a vegetable garden, whether they needed to buy another milk cow. Ordinary domestic conversations that felt extraordinary to two people who had found family in the most unlikely circumstances. "Mary Catherine," Chayton had said suddenly, interrupting her thoughts about bean plantings, "I need to ask you something." She had looked up to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Nervous, hopeful, vulnerable in a way that made her breath catch. "I know this isn't conventional," he had begun, his usual confident demeanor replaced by something awkward and endearing. A Lakota warrior and a white widow trying to raise a mixed-blood child in a frontier town. Most people would say it's impossible, that we're too different, that it could never work. "Most people," Mary Catherine had replied softly, "don't know us." "No, they don't." He had reached for her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. "They don't know that you saved my daughter's life when no one else would even try. They don't know that you learned my language just to sing her lullabies. They don't know that you faced down a lynch mob to protect us, or that you've given me a reason to hope for a future I never thought possible." Mary Catherine had felt tears prick her eyes. "Chayton, they don't know that I love you," he had continued, his voice growing stronger, "not just for what you've done for Ayana, but for who you are. Your courage, your kindness, the way you see people's hearts instead of just their skin. They don't know that every morning when I wake up, my first thought is gratitude that you're in our lives." He had slid off the porch swing then, going down on one knee in front of her with a small object in his hands, a ring he had carved from elk antler, inlaid with tiny turquoise stones in a pattern that looked like flowers. "Mary Catherine Whitmore," he had said formally, "would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Of being Ayana's mother not just in your heart, but in the eyes of the law? Of building a life with me that honors both our peoples and belongs fully to neither?" Mary Catherine had looked down at this remarkable man, this warrior who had been brave enough to beg for his daughter's life, and gentle enough to learn lullabies in a foreign language. She had thought of all the reasons why it shouldn't work, the cultural differences, the ongoing prejudice they would face, the challenges of raising a mixed-race child in a world that didn't always welcome such unions. Then she had looked at Ayana, crawling happily on her blanket and babbling to herself in 2 languages, and she had known that love really could conquer anything. "Yes," she had whispered. "Yes, absolutely yes." Now 3 weeks later, Mary Catherine adjusted her simple blue dress, the best one she owned, and checked her reflection in the small mirror by the kitchen window. She had woven wildflowers into her hair, the same purple asters Chayton had brought her that first morning after Sheriff Coleman's threats. They had become a symbol of hope for both of them, proof that beautiful things could grow even in harsh circumstances. "You look perfect," Chayton said softly, coming up behind her and placing his hands gently on her shoulders. He was wearing the clothes Dr. Morrison had helped him select, dark trousers, a white shirt, and a vest that complemented his copper skin beautifully. But he had also braided 2 feathers into his hair, a reminder of his heritage that Mary Catherine found deeply moving. "So do you," she replied, leaning back against his chest for just a moment, drawing strength from his presence. A knock at the door interrupted them. Dr. Morrison entered, carrying his medical bag in one hand and a small bouquet of roses from his own garden in the other. "For the bride," he said gallantly, presenting the flowers with a theatrical bow that made Ayana clap her hands in delight. "Thank you," Mary Catherine said, accepting the roses with genuine gratitude. Over the past months, Dr. Morrison had become more than a friend. He had become the father figure she hadn't realized she needed, offering advice, support, and the kind of unconditional acceptance that had helped make this day possible. "Are we ready?" Pastor Williams appeared in the doorway, his wife Martha beside him. Both were dressed in their Sunday best, and both were beaming with joy. "The whole town's waiting," Martha added with excitement. "Well, the good parts of the town, anyway." Mary Catherine felt a flutter of nerves. They had expected maybe a dozen people to attend. The church women who had supported them, a few other allies, perhaps some of the territorial officials Marshal Davies had invited. But according to Martha, the church was nearly full. "Don't worry," Chayton murmured in her ear. "We face them together." And they did. Walking into the small church with Ayanna in Mary Catherine's arms and Chayton's hand steady at her back, Mary Catherine was amazed to see nearly 50 people in the pews. Dr. Morrison's grandson sat in the front row, waving shyly at Ayanna. Mrs. Kelly and her entire family had come, along with most of the other churchwomen. Marshal Davies sat near the back in his official capacity, but his presence felt supportive rather than supervisory. Most surprising of all, there were several Lakota faces in the congregation, members of Chayton's small band who had made the journey to witness their leader's wedding to the white woman who had saved his daughter. Pastor William's ceremony was simple but deeply moving. He spoke of love that transcends boundaries, of families formed by choice rather than blood, of the courage required to build something new in a world that often fears change. When it came time for vows, Chayton spoke first, his voice carrying clearly through the church as he promised to love and protect Mary Catherine for the rest of his days, to honor her courage and cherish her kindness, to build with her a home where their daughter could grow up proud of both her heritages. Mary Catherine's voice trembled slightly as she made her own promises, but her words were clear and strong. She vowed to love Chayton, not despite their differences, but because of them, to help him preserve his culture while building their future, to raise Ayanna with knowledge of both worlds so she could choose her own path with wisdom and pride. When Pastor Williams pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared was gentle, reverent, and full of promise for the years ahead. The reception afterward was held in the church hall, with food contributed by dozens of families and music provided by a fiddler who had arrived unexpectedly from the next county. Mary Catherine found herself passed from one conversation to another, accepted and celebrated by people who had once viewed her with suspicion. But the moment that meant the most came near the end of the evening, when old Jim Fletcher, the same man who had once claimed to hear heathen chanting from her garden, approached with his hat in his hands. Mrs. Crow Feather," he began awkwardly. I need to apologize for the things I said, the stories I spread. I was wrong, and I'm ashamed of myself." Mary Catherine looked at this weathered old man who had the courage to admit his mistakes publicly and felt her heart soften completely. "We all make mistakes, Mr. Fletcher," she said gently. "What matters is learning from them." "Yes, ma'am." He glanced over at where Chayton was demonstrating traditional Lakota games for a group of fascinated children. "He's a good man, your husband. Lucky to have found each other." "Yes," Mary Catherine agreed, watching her new husband patiently explain the rules to eager young faces. "We are." The morning sun streamed through the windows of the small house that Chayton and Mary Catherine had built together on the outskirts of Sage Valley, casting golden light across the kitchen where Mary Catherine was preparing breakfast. The new house was larger than her old one, designed to accommodate their growing family and the frequent visitors who came to seek Chayton's guidance or simply to enjoy the hospitality that had become legendary throughout the territory. Ayanna, now 18 months old and walking with the confident swagger of a child who had never doubted she was loved, toddled around the kitchen, chattering in her unique mixture of English and Lakota. She had her father's dark eyes and her mother's gentle nature, combined with a stubborn independence that reminded everyone who saw her that she was destined for great things. "Ina," she said clearly, tugging on Mary Catherine's skirt and holding up her arms to be lifted. Mary Catherine smiled as she picked up her daughter, not by blood but by choice, love, and legal adoption that Marshal Davies had helped arrange. "Good morning, little bird," she said in Lakota, a language she now spoke fluently enough to dream in. The sound of hoofbeats outside announced the arrival of their first visitor of the day. Through the window, Mary Catherine could see Dr. Morrison dismounting with his usual careful attention to his aging bones. At 72, he had officially retired from active practice, but he still made regular visits to check on his favorite patients. "Uncle Samuel," Ayanna called out, using the honorary title she had bestowed on the kind doctor who had helped save her life. "Where's Papa?" Dr. Morrison asked as he entered, accepting Ayana's enthusiastic hug with the practiced ease of a man who had become an honorary grandfather. Teaching the new arrivals, Mary Catherine replied, nodding toward the meadow beyond their house, where Chayton could be seen working with a group of young Lakota men. 3 more families came in yesterday, ready to register with territorial authorities. Chayton's helping them understand the legal requirements while teaching their children how to maintain their traditions. It had become Chayton's unofficial role in the community, serving as a bridge between the old ways and the new requirements, helping his people navigate the complex world of territorial politics while preserving what mattered most about their heritage. "And how are you feeling?" Dr. Morrison asked, his experienced eyes taking in Mary Catherine's slightly fuller figure and the telltale glow that spoke of new life beginning. Mary Catherine's hand moved instinctively to her stomach, where their second child was growing, a baby who would be fully theirs from the moment of birth, a symbol of the love that had grown from desperate need into something enduring and beautiful. "Wonderful," she said honestly. "Tired, but wonderful." "And Chayton, how's he taking the news?" Mary Catherine's smile widened as she remembered her husband's reaction when she had told him about the pregnancy 2 weeks ago. The great warrior had actually cried, holding her carefully as if she might break, whispering prayers of gratitude in Lakota, while Ayana patted his knee and offered comfort in her baby voice. "He's terrified and thrilled in equal measure," she said, "just like any expectant father, I suppose." The sound of laughter from outside drew their attention to the window, where they could see Chayton surrounded by children of various ages, some white, some Lakota, some mixed like Ayana. He was telling them a story, his hands moving expressively as he described brave warriors and clever coyotes, teaching lessons about courage and wisdom that transcended cultural boundaries. "He's found his calling," Dr. Morrison observed. "Teacher, leader, bridge builder, the territory's lucky to have him." "We're all lucky to have each other," Mary Catherine replied, watching as Ayana escaped from the kitchen and ran toward her father on unsteady legs. Chayton scooped her up without missing a beat in his story, settling her on his lap where she listened with rapt attention to tales of her heritage. Later that evening, as they sat on their front porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of rose and gold, Mary Catherine reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment of perfect contentment. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked Chayton quietly, her head resting on his shoulder while Ayana napped in her arms. "Giving up the wandering life, settling in one place, dealing with territorial bureaucrats and town councils?" Chayton was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. "I regret nothing that brought me to you," he said finally, "and I regret nothing that gave Ayana the chance to grow up in both worlds, to choose her own path with knowledge and pride." He paused, his arm tightening around Mary Catherine's shoulders. "Besides," he added with gentle humor, "someone has to make sure this town doesn't forget that love is stronger than fear, that families come in many forms, and that sometimes the most beautiful things grow from the most unexpected beginnings." Mary Catherine smiled, thinking of all the changes that had come to Sage Valley in the past year. The new school where children of all backgrounds learned together. The trading post that welcomed native and white customers with equal respect. The church where Pastor Williams preached sermons about acceptance and love that drew visitors from surrounding counties. Most of all, she thought of the other unlikely families that had formed in their wake. The young white woman who had married a Cherokee trader, the widowed Mexican rancher who had adopted 3 orphan Cheyenne children, the former cavalry officer who had found peace working alongside the Lakota he had once fought. Their love story had started with a desperate father and a dying baby, but it had become something larger. Proof that love really could conquer hate, that understanding could bridge any divide, and that families formed by choice were often stronger than those bound only by blood. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Mary Catherine closed her eyes and listened to the sounds of home. Chayton's steady breathing, Ayana's soft snores, the distant laughter of children playing in the meadow, the gentle lowing of cattle settling down for the night. It was the sound of a dream made real, of a future built on love rather than fear, of a place where a Lakota warrior's baby could grow up knowing that she belonged to all worlds and was welcomed in everyone. The battle for acceptance had been won, but more importantly, The war for understanding continued every day in small acts of kindness, moments of connection, and the simple decision to choose love over hate, hope over fear, and family over everything else. In the end, that was all that really mattered. Thank you for joining us for another Wild West Stories tale. If this story touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Remember, love knows no boundaries, and sometimes the most beautiful families are the ones we choose for ourselves. Hit that notification bell for more stories of courage, redemption, and love on the American frontier, and never forget that every ending is just a new beginning waiting to unfold.